Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning. I'm glad that we can meet again. Today, we will have another virtual class in research and English language teaching. Today, we will discuss about causal comparative research. And I want you to pay attention for this, and you can decide whether you will do the research by using the causal comparative design or correlational research design or experimental research design. Today, we will start with the causal comparative research. Okay? Have a great time and let's start. Okay, let's start. Now, we are discussing about causal comparative research. Okay, the aims of the session is that by the end of the session, we would like you to be able to describe what causal comparative research is. Secondly, I want you to demonstrate understanding of the usage of the causal comparative research. And thirdly, we want you to describe understanding of the difference between causal comparative and experimental research. And fourthly, we would like you to demonstrate understanding of how to test hypothesis in causal comparative research, okay? And lastly, you have to give us the examples of causal comparative research. This session, this virtual session is basically as the starting point to give you insight for discussion. And after that, you need to have a discussion with your friends, with your groups. And of course, I will be there to always support you with your communication and consultation. And be acknowledged that this material is actually not my own original work, but this is the original work of Stephen E. Brook, PhD, from California State University, Sacramento. So I use this for the educational purposes to let you know about the causal comparative research, okay? So let us continue now. Okay, so if we are talking about the causal comparative research, it means that we are actually talking about the groups, and the groups are defined by differences. Yeah, the groups that are having differences in some pre-existing variables, which is the independent variables. Okay, the points that we need to take a points that firstly, in causal comparative, we are dealing with group differences, and group differences exist before the study begins. For example, variables like social economic status or SES, gender or ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, for example. Okay. Because we are using the works of Stephen Brooks, then we are discussing what he has already researched. Okay, he has a research on ADHD and SES. Okay. So group membership is the independent variables, and in terms of experiment will deal with the group differences which are assigned by the researcher. Okay. So actually, causal comparative research is similar with experiments, but it's different. Okay. And in the experimental design, we have some designs, some types of designs like ex post facto, one group pre-test and post-test design, two group pre-test post-test designs, and other things. Okay. So in experiments, we are dealing with groups differences, which are assigned by the researchers, for example, type of instructions, approach to counseling, for example. Okay. And the group differences do not exist before the study begins. Okay, let's go on. Okay, we are now having a questions whether and to what degree groups are differ on another variables, the dependent variables or measure. In causal comparative, for example, we have questions like, do children from a social economic status, which is IV, independent variables, backgrounds, attain higher achievement levels, which is the dependent variables, than children from low social economic status backgrounds. Okay. In experiment, we will have a questions like, do children who learn to read via reading mastery as the independent variables attain higher achievement levels, the dependent variables, than children who learn to read via full language approach? Okay. In this case, you can see the difference, a bit difference. Then, of course, you will have a discussion after this with your group, and I'll help you to understand more in our discussion later on. Okay. Okay. So, there are two questions that we need to also answer. What would make this experiment a causal comparative study? Ya, apa yang menjadi ini menjadi berubah menjadi causal comparative study ya? Second question is, why might an educational researchers want to make this into such a study? Lalu kenapa kita sebagai peneliti pendidikan menginginkan untuk memakainya, untuk menggunakan desain causal comparative study? Okay. So these two questions need to be answered, and I want you to have discussion before I explain to you. And in this virtual session, I will not explain about this, but I will explain directly in the discussion among your groups. Okay. Okay. So reason for employing a causal comparative approach is that causal comparative methods are typically used because the variables under study, like the independent variables, cannot be directly manipulated. So a bit difference between the experimental group, experimental study, and the causal comparative study. In causal comparative study, we cannot manipulate the variables, the independent variables. Meanwhile, in the experimental study, we assign first the independent variables. Okay, just like this one, it's like genders, age, and others. Okay, and secondly, the independent variables should not be manipulated too, like destructive habits, disease, or disorders, or others. So, why else would the causal comparative method be used? We can discuss further. Please read the materials that I have already given you, the books, 9 books. We will use the Park's books. Then in your discussion, you can ask me with the clarity on this. Okay, so reason for employing a causal comparative approach. These methods are also sometimes used to help determine if the more complicated and expensive experimental design is worthwhile. The question is that did our prior discussion identify this as the possible reason for conducting causal comparative study of reading mastery? Okay, because we need to read the case that we have in our literature to answer this one. Okay, let's go on. Okay, variables often examined in causal comparative studies. There are two variables, internal variables and external variables. Internal variables, for example, the organismic ability and personal characteristic, for example. And the external means the family related, school related, like just social community related. Okay. And your task today is to identify examples in each of these 5 categories. Okay. We can find it in the references that I have already sent you. Okay. So this would be the independent variables in a causal comparative study. So you can see now the sources of the independent variables, like the internal variables and the external variables. Okay. Like the internal variables, the organismic things, ability, personal characteristics, and the external variables, family related, school related, or community. Okay. In detail, we will discuss in our group discussion. Okay. Okay, there are 2 basic research designs like this. Okay. And the causal comparative research. Later, when we are discussing about the experimental design, you will see the difference from this one from the experimental design. Okay. There are 2 groups of design, for example, the case A, and this is case B. The group consists of the experimental groups and comparison group. And you have the independent variable of X and dependent variable of O. Okay. So in the second design, you can just see experimental group with X1 and X2, and the dependent variables is O. So later on, when you learn the experimental approach, you will also likely see such kind of design in the one group pre and post test design. Okay, let's go on. Okay, how about the control procedures? Okay, firstly, an ex post facto. Now we are talking about ex post facto study. Ex post facto study is really a type of experimental study. And next meeting, we will discuss about, in the next meeting, we'll discuss about the ex post facto study as part of the experimental research. In this case, it is difficult to make conclusions about causal relationship between the 2 variables in ex post facto. Okay, in detail, we will discuss in our session on the experimental research. Okay. One cannot be sure that the 2 groups do not differ with respect to variables other than the 5 variables under study. So we need to consider the possibility that dependent measure changes as a result are due to factors other than independent variables like group membership. Okay. Sometimes you are aware of these alternative explanations for group differences before you begin a study. For example, in group study of the effect of ADHD, okay? ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Okay. On reading comprehension, I was aware that ADHD often coexists with reading disabilities. Okay, that's the situation. And the presence of ADHD children with reading disabilities in his samples, not my samples yet, in Brooks samples, would have been confounding variables. Okay. So in causal comparative studies, the researchers select comparable groups of people or comparable physical environments and then collect data on a variety of relevant variables. And the purpose of the selecting comparable samples is to isolate factors that could reveal a cause for significant differences in the levels of measured variables. Okay. In detail, we will discuss this in our focus group discussion. What we mean by confounding variables: any variables on which groups in an experiment systematically differ other than the variable whose effect the research is interested in determining is confounding variable. Okay? So any variable on which groups in an experiment systematically differ other than the variables whose effect the research is interested in determining is a confounding variables. Because of an inability or to randomly assign participants, confounds are especially problematic than conducting the unexposed factor study. Okay. So this is what we mean by confounding variables. Okay. The random assignment of an experiment minimizes such confounding effects. So, okay, in experiment, we can do the randomized samples from the populations. Here, we even do not manipulate the variables in the subjects. Okay. Well, this is the models that Brooks' work is ADHD associated with relative reading comprehension difficulties. That is the framework. And another question should be asked when we are looking at this framework. Okay, how might a causal comparative study attempt to address this confound? So you see now that here we call it confounding variables. So secondly, there's questions on do learning disabilities cause low self-concept? So you can see the framework of the aspect for the differences or the effects of disabilities with low self-concept. Okay? So a question should be addressed that is that how might causal comparative study attempt to address this confound? This is again confound variable. Okay, how about this sample selection control procedure? First, match pair design. It means that systematically we select participant pairs who are similar in all important ways other than the independent variables. And secondly, a homogeneous grouping design. With the exception of the independent variables of group membership, make sure that the participants in both groups are very similar in all important ways. Okay. So that is the way to have this sample selection. Okay, the data analysis. The data analysis is usually researchers will use the factorial analysis of variance. Okay. statistical way to assess the effects of the potentials compounds on the independent measures. Okay? So factorial analysis or analysis of covariance, just like this. Okay. Well, these are the data analysis that are appropriate for causal comparative research. Firstly, descriptive statistics, of course, because we always need to count the mean and standard deviations, and inferential statistic using t-tests to see the differences between the two dependent measures means. Then ANOVA, we also sometimes use the ANOVA because we will see the difference between 3 or more dependent measure means. So if you have 3 or more dependent measure means, then you use the ANOVA. Okay, or we use the chi-square, which is the difference between the frequency of occurrence of the dependent measures. So these are the measure of data analysis for the causal comparative research. Okay, so these are the insights for you to start learning with your friends in groups. And of course, I will be there to help you in groups. And today, in our virtual class course for just around 15 to 20 minutes, we can start with these insights. Then in the next levels that you do your work with your friends, and you can communicate with me, okay, directly for consultation. And of course, you will have a presentation in your groups. Okay, thank you very much, and we'll see you again in the next session. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah.